introduction, Chris. I just want to start by saying how privileged I am to be here at IUP. I know Chris Kanyasti for a very long time, and he's a very famous and very reputable and very important researcher in his field. And it's I'm proud to be able to visit his department and to meet some of his students and colleagues. As Chris mentioned, I've come across the sea to be here with you. I'm at the National University of Ireland in Galway. On the slide there's a little bit of a map where you can see the trajectory. According to the map, it takes 14 hours to get here and costs €1,000, but actually it doesn't. It's actually less than both of those things. There's a picture of my university on screen as well. And what I will do is I will make the slides available to you guys so that when the small print comes on screen, you don't have to be taking notes or squinting. You'll get some of the impressions today, but you can also drill down and go on the hyperlinks and things like that later in your own time. And down at the bottom right-hand corner, there are some pictures. Just some interesting facts for you. On the left is Neanderthal man. And Neanderthal man was named after fossils found in the Neander Valley in Germany, but it was named Neanderthal man and identified as an independent human species by a professor at my university in Galway in Ireland. So Professor William King coined the term Neanderthal man. Next to that, there's a representation of some stuff which includes an electron. And again, a professor at my university came up with the name electron for the smallest unit of that particular particle. And there's some other bits and pieces there. So science happens in all sorts of strange places, even in the periphery of Ireland, in small universities 100 years ago. Science is something that's part of our culture. It's something that every educational institution, but also every civics institution has a stake in. And so it's very important that we are at least somewhat capable of understanding what it is science is and how it works, and what it is information is and how we come to know it. So today's talk, I'm going to explore some of the ways in which science is communicated in daily life. Because it's all very well having things going on in universities and in research institutes, but if it is truly important to civic society and to the population at large, then it is important to reflect on how it is communicated outside of those ivory towers. Now we all know what scientists look like. They look pretty much like that, and if they don't look like that, they probably look like that. And this is an interesting thing for psychologists because some psychologists are interested in how impressions are formed, how stereotypes are created, and lots of researchers do things like ask kids to draw pictures of scientists just to see what it is kids think science involves. And when they do that, we often find, and there's actually a test in psychology called the Draw a Scientist test. And it is used not just to see what kids think scientists look like, but to see at what age the earliest stereotypes are formed by children. So you've got children of different ages to draw scientists. And they often draw men, they most often draw men, people with glasses, people who are white, people who wear lab coats, and work in laboratories and so on. So we all know what scientists look like, and they look like this. Of course, do they actually look like this? We don't know. Okay. Now, as Chris said, my research, and indeed his research, concerns the notion of mental stress. Behavior and cognition and attitudes and emotions are all subject to scientific research exploration as well. And when we are, as scientists, looking at stress, we might say, tongue-in-cheek, this is how academics learn about stress. They read the Encyclopedia of Stress, which you can get on Amazon. It's in 3 volumes, and it costs just $349, okay? The updated version, the newer version, is a 4-volume set, so obviously we've discovered more about stress, and we can write a 4-volume encyclopedia, and it costs $1,700 on Amazon. So here's one of the links you're going to be clicking on a bit later to follow up. And indeed, at the bottom it says it's free 2-day shipping for students. So there's a bargain there in there somewhere. Okay. But how do other people who aren't academics learn about stress? Well, they learn about stress by reading about it in magazines and in the media and in the news. And at the end of the day, that's how most people learn about stress. So when people are thinking, does stress cause heart attacks? Does stress, can you deal with stress using complementary therapies? Anything like this, people are not going to consult the 4-volume, $1,700 encyclopedia of stress. They're going to read in the general media. And that's what we're going to be thinking about today. I want to show you a quick, by way of introduction, one of the problems that this creates. Okay, so some researchers looked at attitudes of different groups of people towards what matters and what's important about science news. And they selected stories for people to consider from various magazines and sources. And when they were asking news journalists to explain what they looked for in science news, they scored it like this. They saw that the social context of science news was the most important thing they were looking for. They thought that the procedures in science news, the research procedures, and anything with numbers in it were also very important. And the least important things were things like related research. They didn't really care what other research had been conducted on the matter. They were only interested in the study that was subject of the press release, for example. When they asked, this is the interesting bit, when they asked audiences what they were looking for in science news, they said that they also really like numbers. They also liked something that referred to scientific theory and procedures. They weren't that interested in related research either, and they weren't interested in what would consider the applied relevance of the research. And when scientists themselves were asked what they looked for in science news, they had a completely different outlook on many of the factors. So the scientists were very interested in the related research. If they were going to judge a science story they saw in the media, they were going to judge it in the context of other research they were aware of. Audiences and journalists did not take that approach. When they were considering the applied relevance of research, that was important to them. Numbers were less important. So when a scientist is reading science stories in the media, they're not as interested in numbers, they're not as persuaded by numbers. They don't think that is important to a message in science. So what we can see from research like this is that audiences, journalists, and scientists have completely different worldviews when it comes to describing science in a public context. They think different things are important. And so what this creates is a problem where scientists think X is important, but the journalists think Y is important, and the journalist reports Y. And the audience only has Y to go on. And therefore, it's good that people get science news in the mainstream media, but the problem is it's not quite the same format or the same priority structure as it should be in the minds of the people who are actually generating the science in the first place. And when we consider the media more generally, you're probably well aware at this stage that what happens and what appears in the media, in news media, is not necessarily the latest stuff to happen in the world. Things don't appear in the news media just because they happen in the real world and are important. They appear in the news media because the news media put it there. And they are subject to various restrictions on their time and on their resources. They don't like long stories, they prefer short stories. They don't like vague stories, they prefer hard news. They have to have it in the news as soon as possible, and if it's out of date tomorrow, as far as they're concerned, or if it's not in the news today, then it's out of date tomorrow. And they have to compete with each other to have the most dramatic news, the most exciting news. And all of these pressures mean that what you read in the news and what you see online in news sources and what you hear about on the TV news is not necessarily an accurate representation of what's in the world. It's subject to this filtering of priorities, of airtime and limited space and so forth. So we don't have time. People do whole degrees on this slide alone, namely the communication of news. But I just want to give you a sense of that before we move on. So there are lots of distortions here, and it applies just as much to science news as it does to political news. Okay. So what I'm going to do, because it's more fun to do it this way, but I wanted to set the scene. I'm going to run through a short list of things that happen, things that go wrong, basically, when research is pitched to lay audiences. And there's about 5 or 6 things that we're going to talk to you about 6 particular examples of things that happen. And I'm going to be alluding to media theory, communications theory, but just also common sense to an extent. And I'm going to give you some examples of what I mean. And hopefully that will help create the message that I want to create. So let me progress it. The first thing that happens is that news is distorted in order that it fits what we refer to as a media frame. And what I'm referring to here is that science happens in a laboratory or in a university, and then the media look at that science and then change it in order to report it to its audience and in order to, in many occasions, fulfill its agendas. Here's an example of this in action. This is why you can get the same news reported differently in different media, because they're fitting it into different frames. So this is an example of a study where some mathematicians decided to try to compute how much methane gas dinosaurs would have emitted when at the peak of dinosaur population. Because there is a theory relating to the extinction of dinosaurs that involves global warming, and we know that herds of agricultural and other animals create certain types of gases. So let's see what happens, how much methane would be created by dinosaurs farting. Okay, so they did a mathematical model. And this website reported just mundanely how they calculated how much per year methane gas was generated by the world's population of dinosaurs. All right. The Wall Street Journal decided to report this news saying dinosaur gas emissions may have warmed the air. So they're just explaining it a little bit more in their headline. CBS went with dinosaur gas may have warmed prehistoric Earth. So they're upping the ante. It's not the air that's warmed, it's the entire planet that gets warmed. So global warming is suddenly part of the language. BBC went with dinosaur gases warmed the Earth. So remember, the original researchers didn't prove this. They just tried to calculate how much gas there would be. But suddenly, it's all about proof has been found that the Earth was warmed by dinosaur farts. And Fox News, dinosaurs gassed themselves into extinction, according to British scientists. So their frame is different. They want to talk about how the victim is to blame. So and they want to talk about how global warming and related phenomena pre-exist humanity. So if we're talking about man-made climate change, it's really just a myth because it's always happening and has been happening for thousands of years. So their media frame is different. The original study had nothing to do with this, and it's not as though the dinosaurs were theorized to have gassed themselves anyway. It was to do with methane and climate change and things like that. Okay. So you get headline inflation. The same story is reported differently, sometimes in a very distorted manner, in different media, because they are making it fit different frames. Here's one of my favorite examples of this. This is from the Mail Online. This is the British newspaper, the Daily Mail, which is the world's largest news website now. So it gets more hits and more traffic every day than any other news website in the world. So they're talking about bad news on TV makes you fat. All right, this is of concern to its readers and to its agendas. And it's a psychology study. Viewers increase food intake by 40% when bombarded by gloomy bulletins. Okay, so what lay behind that particular study? You can read the small print later. There is an actual study involved here. And researchers in an American university conducted a study, and you can read about this, but more people read the Daily Mail every second than read the particular journal in probably a year, to be perfectly honest. Okay, so the researchers, they set up a stall in a university corridor, and they captured 121 passers-by on a college campus. They had secretly put on the wall behind them posters that said words. And there were 2 conditions in the experiment. For half the participants, the words said things like survival, persistence, shortfall, struggle, and adversity. And these, the researchers said, were negative words, they were negative primes. And for half the participants, the posters were different, and they had different words on them that were considered to be neutral. Meanwhile, on the desk, they had a bowl of M&Ms that they had all counted and weighed beforehand. And what they effectively did was that they tracked how many M&Ms passers-by chewed on while they were filling out a survey without realizing they were part of an experiment into how much they would eat when there were posters on the wall that said things like adversity and survival. Okay, and the theory was, believe it or not, that when you have adversity, survival, withstand, and these kind of emotive words in the background, these serve as negative emotional primes and make you eat more. Okay? Now, you can choose not to believe that theory is sound, and to be honest with you, I'm not convinced that the evidence for it is overwhelming. However, when they counted the M&Ms at the end, they found that on average, and I won't go into the further details here on the study design, suffice to say, on average, the number of M&Ms eaten by weight when the emotional hard words, the emotional negative words were on the posters behind, was 18.9 grams compared to 13.6 grams in the other condition, therefore 40% of a difference. And that's all there was to it. There were no gloomy bulletins, there were no people on watching TV, there was nothing to do with news. It was just how many M&Ms you eat when there's a word adversity on the wall behind you, and you're supposed to have seen it, you're assumed to have seen it, and to be subconsciously influenced by that. So I think that is an example of distorting a scientific study in order to fit a media frame. Because the Daily Mail wants to report news about how terrible everything is, and even though the study was about M&Ms, they described it as about gloomy bulletins. But there are no gloomy bulletins. So when you see science reported in the media, certainly in the Daily Mail or the Mail Online, it is not necessarily reporting accurately what happens. But more people read the Mail Online than read the actual original study. When you actually look at the X makes you fat, this is one of the world's most powerful media frames. So if you do a Google search on something makes you fat, you'll find that, well, in this search, nearly 16,000 different search results are coming back telling you what makes you fat in different contexts. And you might think this is a trivial matter, and in some cases it might be, but some magazines and some media outlets are particularly obsessed with this subject. So here are some things that might make you fat according to Marie Claire. I don't know, do you read Marie Claire? But anyway, you might already know some of this. Leggings. Are leggings making you fat? Could your fridge be making you fat? Curvy models make women fat. We are nearly always talking about women here. Is diet making you fat? Healthy foods, common virus, the gym, air conditioning, and so on. All these things make you fat. All right. And then the pièce de résistance from Marie Claire, can't thinking too much make you fat. So their media frame is almost like, don't be thinking, don't be doing that. That's not what we want. And all of these news stories, purported news stories, are rooted in some research that has been released into a journal, and in order to find its way into the mainstream media, it has to be extracted by an interested media outlet to fit a particular frame that it wants to write about. So be aware of all of this when you're reading about science in the media. Some scientific studies are reported with a socially conservative frame. Want a secret to a happy marriage? Don't have sex before the wedding, says the Daily Mail. And it's reporting on a study that says that people who don't have sex before they're married are happier. The study was conducted at Brigham Young University. So straight away you've got a unique population of participants, and the ideas maybe not as broad-ranging as might be typical of a more comprehensive study. But the Daily Mail isn't interested in that because it has found something that supports its socially conservative agenda. Likewise, marriage triples your chances of surviving major heart surgery. They did a study and they reported the news that being married means you're more likely to recover from a heart attack. But what they didn't report is that the methodology of that study included cohabiting people who aren't officially married as the married group. So it is a study of social support and of having an intimate personal relationship. It's a study of having sex. Having sex triples your chances of surviving major heart surgery. You could just as easily have said. But they decided to have a picture of a married couple and people walking down the aisle and use all this language because it is promoting its socially conservative agenda. Many outlets take a socially liberal agenda and fit the news into that. So different studies about social conservatives have lower IQs, according to one research study. Another study, thinking can undermine religious faith. Now these things are reported as news, even though the methodologies are very weak. But just like the socially conservative outlets, the socially liberal outlets lower their skeptical guard and hold the science to a lower standard of rigor in order to report it. For example, the study on thinking undermines religious faith is they got college students to stare at two photographs. One was a photograph of Rodin's statue, The Thinker, that you see, this famous statue of a man with his head in his hand. And another was a study of, or a photograph of a different statue. Okay? Then they got people to fill in a questionnaire about what they thought about religion and superstition. And they found that the people who studied the man with his head in his hands were more dismissive of religion and superstition than the other group. And they said that staring at the statue of the man thinking was getting you to think about thinking, and therefore to be skeptical of religion. And that's all the method was. And it was a really weak methodology by any standard. I mean, do you think staring at a picture of a statue of a person thinking makes you think more? I mean, I don't know. But they found it with a tiny sample, they reported it, the media outlet weren't interested in critiquing the methodology, they just wanted to report the finding because it fits their particular frame. Middle class frame, fast food gives you the blues, the study finds. So this is kind of saying, well, fast food is bad. It has to be bad because it's fast food. It's almost completely circular reasoning. Meanwhile, chocolate might help you get slim. And we'll talk about a little bit about this a bit later. Both of these are cross-sectional surveys that show that when that people who eat lots of fast food are more likely to be sad. But what they don't control for in that study is they're also more likely to be unemployed in the data. And what you're talking about here are people who are poor, who are suffering life stress, who report high scores for depression and then eat junk food because that's all they can afford, or maybe that's all that they are informed about. Okay, so you've got all sorts of really serious issues here, but that's not of interest. All we want to give is a middle class message: fast food bad, but chocolate, which is kind of a fast food, or a middle class, you're allowed to eat chocolate, it's a nice thing. That helps keep you thin, even though it really doesn't. Okay, and then more interestingly, or more maybe directly damagingly, you have the techno-skeptic frame. The idea that technology must be bad. And you get this throughout generations, really. People used to think that books were bad. That reading books, in Victorian times, reading books would strain your eyes, would promote sedentary behavior in children, would undermine your social skills, would expose you to frightening imagery and ideas that would traumatize you. All the things that people nowadays say about video games and stuff, they used to say about books. So anything new that comes along is considered threatening to some authorities. Okay, you should eat your greens because it makes you optimistic about the future. I mean, that study doesn't really say that. It's another cross-sectional study that finds people who eat vegetables score high for optimism. But if you think about that as a psychologist, if you score low for optimism, you're really pessimistic about life. You're not likely to kind of care about your diet, and you're not going to eat as well. So it's really your attitude that promotes your food behavior rather than the other way around. Okay, it's just a cross-sectional study reported in a particular way to meet a particular worldview. Breastfeeding leads to better behavior in children is another one, but I don't have time to get into the details on that. But that's another weak study promoted by, in a techno-skeptic way, because that is in an outlet that typically reports techno-skeptic news. Okay, some of these are just other examples of studies that tell you the world and technology is bad, even though the underlying research doesn't really say this, but it is projected in that way. Perhaps the most conspicuous example you might already be aware of is the idea that vaccination is somehow dangerous, and in particular, vaccination against mumps, measles, and rubella, the 3-in-1 vaccine, is associated with risk of autism. Have you encountered that? I've no doubt that you have, really, to be fair. Okay. You probably are somewhat aware also that this relates to a study that was conducted in the late 1990s and reported in the British Medical Journal. And it was by this author, Andrew Wakefield. And they found in a small study, they reported that they found in a small study a link between vaccination and mumps, measles, and rubella. Now, in actual fact, they didn't. The data was not just misleading, it was 12 kids in the study. And the data they got were things like parent reports of what happened when it happened. And then they took other information from medical records. But what they didn't reveal was, in some cases, they ignored kids that didn't fit the story. In other cases, they changed the numbers. They actually changed the medical record. It culminated in Andrew Wakefield being found guilty on over 370 counts of medical malpractice and being struck off the medical register. Nonetheless, we have found over the intervening period a reduction in uptake of vaccination and a corresponding increase, exactly when you'd expect to happen, of the diseases that are being vaccinated against. And one interesting, although sad, dimension to this is that there is an increase now in rubella cases right across North America and Europe. And rubella during pregnancy is a risk factor for autism in its own right. So you actually probably have more autism in the world as a result of this downturn in vaccination rather than the opposite. In Ireland, where I teach, we have it now in the colleges. And just exactly where you'd expect it. The study came out in 1997. There was a bit of a ripple and a time taken for that to take hold. Now we have all of these people in their late teens coming to college with mumps. And we have mumps cases that we never had before because they're not vaccinated. And you need a certain percentage of the population to be vaccinated in order for it to work. You need to have what's called herd immunity. So even if you are vaccinated, if fewer than a certain percentage of everybody else isn't, then you could still get mumps. You could still get measles. You could still get rubella. So you need to have this. So I mean, I don't like the idea that my kids will go to school with other kids who aren't vaccinated. I think that terrifies me, nonetheless. You can read about the data manipulation and indeed the corporate dimension to this. So there was a financial backer to the original 97 study, paying the participants and the guy who wrote the paper to write it in a particular way so that they could get their paper through and have a competitor vaccination product. So you can read all about this. It's well documented. It's been researched in its own right extremely extensively, and yet we still see an anti-vaccination movement, particularly against it, and they will still cite that particular study, even though it has been withdrawn from the literature and disgraced in many, many different ways. Okay, and why do we still see it? Because the anti-vaccination frame is very rigorous in its own right. Ever since vaccinations were invented, there have been anti-vaccinationists. And these researchers looked through the literature in the late 19th century. They found anti-vaccination pamphlets, and they did a qualitative study of the themes that were alluded to. So back in the 19th century, people said that vaccines don't cure illnesses, they cause illnesses. They say that vaccines are, the immunity they provide is only temporary, and things like healthy lifestyle is better than any vaccine. But what they followed up with, the twist in the tail, is they looked at websites from the 21st century and did the same kind of qualitative analysis and found the same themes were prominent in modern anti-vaccination literature. And what this tells us, it gives us some insight as psychologists into the driving forces behind anti-vaccinationism. It is a fear of the vaccine, and then the news items and the studies are made to fit that fear. But these are cross-cutting themes that are more than a century old in their own right. And you find interesting things happen. The anti-vaccination movement we're talking about is prominent in English-speaking countries. It's almost unheard of in other countries, particularly, for example, French-speaking countries. Now, if it was true that MMR caused these illnesses, then this would be seen in any country. It didn't matter what language the information was published in. That shouldn't be a factor at all. But it is a factor. And if vaccinations, if disease risk stops at the border because the language is different, then you have a sign that it's more about culture than medicine. Okay. Let's move on to a second example of things that happen when science is channeled, if you like, through the media. Okay, so we know it's squeezed into a particular frame of reference. The next thing is that the relevance of the news is often conveyed with specific reference to a trigger event. Okay, what is that? Well, researchers have identified that when events happen in the world, political events or social events, it often leads certain items of news being considered more newsworthy. Okay, even if it's old news or slightly stale news, it appears in the media because it's relevant to something else that is in the news. Okay, so what these researchers did, just by way of an example, is they looked at how much news is reported in the New York Times and the Washington Post about climate change. And they found that when the weather outside is hot, more news items on climate change are reported. In other words, when people are thinking about the sun and the sky being hot today, the newspapers then report news about climate change, even though there's no particular extra newsworthiness about climate change, simply because it's not cloudy today and it was yesterday. So we know that in various ways, science news is just as subject as political news to the idea that newsworthiness is partly judged in terms of what else is in the news. So if a link can be made, we have it. So then we have this type of thing. Okay, stress research is again my area of interest. So I'm interested in this story. Stress can help when studying for exams. Okay, so the idea is college students can do better in examinations and tests if they're under stress. That's the news. They're saying scientists have found this. Okay, let's accelerate through this one because it is kind of cute. Of course there's a paper there. So you can go look at the paper, but again, remember, more people will read the newspaper than they will ever read the paper in the original journal. And when you get down to the small print, and it is very small, it does talk about stress makes memories better because of glucocorticoids and things like this. And glucocorticoids are infused after stressful events. But then, I just highlighted there rat and mouse, because the study is of this methodology. This is a water maze, where a rat is put into a tub of water and has to find its way back to the platform, and the water is heated up and it's really hot and so on. And they found that stress, when the rats were actually stressed beforehand, we won't get into the methodology how they stressed out the rats, but they did stress out the rats, and stressed rats found their way back to the platform quicker than other rats. So there you go. You know, stress can make you do better in exams, so long as you are A, a rat, and B, your exam involves the Morris water maze procedure. So, you know, this is the study on the picture, and that's the news story on the left. It's another example, and why is this a trigger? Because this newspaper in particular reports lots of news about examinations around the time the spring examinations take place. And this newspaper has a readership that is composed primarily of grandparents. So they wanted to sell more newspapers, and the grandparents can clip the news and send it off and do good for their grandchildren. And it's all about science stories that are really warped into fitting that particular message, but it is published around examination time, even if the study itself is 6 to 10 months old. All right. A third thing that happens in this type of situation is methodological details are omitted. So studies are often very detailed, and the news doesn't have time to get into it. I'll give you an example. I do research on stress, and there's a whole set of theories about allostatic load. So if all sorts of things happen to you in life, it makes your age more quickly. So you have a biological age as well as a chronological age. And if you encounter more stress, you build this allostatic load that then contributes to premature senescence, premature aging. And we can look at this through different biological markers, contents of your chromosomes called telomeres that shorten over your lifetime, will shorten faster if you encounter more life stress than if you don't. So we can look very detailed in genetic data to demonstrate the phenomenon called allostatic load. Okay, so what other angle might we have on this? Well, here's the Daily Star. Sex makes you look younger and live longer. Okay, so it's also interested in the concept of allostatic load and things that you can do to prevent premature aging. So it reports a finding. Scientists say, and this is what scientists say, but where does this come from? It comes from a press release that says that a guy is going to a conference on the psychology of older people and is going to say what he thinks about this. There's no data at all. So a sex therapist is going to talk about all the old clients he has, and they're all really happy and vigorous because they have lots of sex. That was his topic. It goes into a press release, and then we have science makes you, or sex makes you look younger and live longer. And a picture of Kim Kardashian, who's like 32 or something, nothing to do with older people or anything like this, because Kim Kardashian is another sort of news item in her own right. So you have methodological details that are not always reported in science news. Stress levels make you fat. I'm interested in that concept, as you could probably tell. It's a study of mice. Okay, if you're a mouse, it might make you fat. Okay. Another thing that happens is the context of research might not be clear. Here's more food stuff. Here's food, sex, and everything else. Okay, women think about food more than sex. This is Mary Claire again. I got a lot of information from Mary Claire. Do women think about food more than sex? Well, according to this survey, they do. So some social scientists or researchers went out, gathered data, asked people the question, recorded the answers, released a press release, and there you go. This survey wasn't published by a scientific journal. It was published by the Atkins Company, who have a stake, a commercial stake, in people's dieting behaviors. And the press release, which was reported as science news by Mary Claire, which admittedly is not where most people would look to for science news, but nonetheless, they reported it as science news. The press release didn't even have a sample size. We have no idea how many people were asked the question. And so the magazine certainly didn't report a sample size or any methodological detail there. So the context is missing, because the context is not scientific research, it's market research. So people are obviously going to put press releases out that support their commercial agendas, and that should really be relayed in any media reporting. And if it's not, then you have a loss of context. The context is pivotal in that type of example. Similarly, the Mature Times and the Daily Mail are reporting a research study that women feel invisible at the age of 46. Now, one thing I notice here, and we have several examples, is that a lot of the distortions here create and preserve hierarchies and prejudices. So the media frames and the triggering events and the ideas being presented are reported in a way that perpetuates sexism. And here is an example. So women feel invisible at the age of 46, the study has revealed. And then there's some quotations about people. The quotation is, more than a quarter of women in the study feel embarrassed at having to pull out their reading glasses. Okay, that's the critical information, because when you actually go and find the press release, you discover that it's more market research by the Claraview company, who sell corrective operations to prevent you having to wear your reading glasses. And not only is that the case, so the commercial company wants you to not wear glasses, wants to sell you eye operations. They do a study that says that women feel invisible at the age of 46 because they don't like having to take off their glasses. They put that into the media, and it's reported as news by media outlets. And in the case of the Daily Mail, they actually use, the press release came with its own photograph. And they used the lady from the website in the image on the news story. They don't even check why they've actually got the material visually as well as in text. Oh. Another way in which context is lost is that other research studies are not mentioned. So you end up with two entirely contradictory research findings published in the same outlet weeks apart, with no reference to the previous finding in the second report. Okay, so you get this type of lack of context. And remember, the scientists like to have the context more than the audiences and the journalists. We have the example called journalism, because I believe that scientists themselves are often at fault here, and very often at fault. That the miscommunication can be traced back to the scientists. Here's a study: vegetarians are less likely to have, are less healthy and will have a lower quality of life than meat eaters. I don't know if vegetarianism common here in the States, but the idea, it's a controversial enough concept in its own right. Vegetarians less healthy according to the study. In the media interview, the researchers who published the study they expressed horror at the way it was reported. And they said, we never said this. So they said, we already have distanced ourselves from this claim because it's cross-sectional and we cannot say what's cause and what's effect. It could be that people turn to vegetarianism because they have low health or something like that. There could be all sorts of reasons. However, when you actually look at the paper and go to paragraph 1, the abstract, it says that we need to have programs to reduce the health risk due to nutritional factors. So actually they do say so in the research study. It's not a misrepresentation. So here you have a study that's actually reported correctly by the journalists, but then the researchers are claiming that it hasn't been. So it gets very complicated because everybody has their own sort of strand of perspective. The context, therefore, is very, very important. Okay, complex concepts, often simplified. I'll give you an example, and I'll give you a trigger warning on this because this is another example of sexism in science news. All right, I do a lot of research in cardiovascular reactivity to stress. This is how your blood pressure changes in response to stress, how your heart rate changes in response to stress. It's a very complex idea, and there's a lot of research out there. Okay, so here's a product that was subject to a press release and reported to Science News by the Mail Online. A smart bra that tells if you're in love and only opens if partners increase your heart rate. This is what they did to my research area. They turned it into this, and they have this video online and this picture, and the idea is that if your heart rate is elevated by something like jogging, it's okay. If it's elevated by something like shopping and eating spicy food, that's okay. But if it's elevated by romance, that pink area in the middle, the smart bra can tell the exact area of elevation of heart rate that is associated with romance and love, and then will enable the bra to open, thereby protecting your dignity and honor. This is supposed to protect your dignity. And they take the scientific concept and they warp it into this. Okay, this is to me, it's particularly troubling on lots of levels. All right. Want to lose weight? This is the last food one. Okay, eat chocolate cake for breakfast. So, now, does that sound right? Okay, so the researchers, I'm just thinking here, maybe we should just stop, right there and then not go with the news story at all. However, they're journalists, it's a newspaper, they have an idea, they want to go with it. So the idea is that the research study shows that eating cake for breakfast contributes to weight loss. Okay, but the context here is lost, and the methodological detail here is lost, I beg your pardon. Because the research doesn't really say that. It's not as though if you don't eat cake for breakfast already, that if you start eating cake, you'll start losing weight. That is manifestly untrue. What they are doing, the research actually found that if you eat cake every day, the time of day at which you eat it contributes to your weight gain. And you will gain less weight if you only eat it in the morning compared to if you eat it in the evening. Okay, so time of day is the variable here, not cake for breakfast. Cake for breakfast is a ridiculous idea if you want to lose weight, but that didn't stop them reporting. If you are the person who eats cake every single day, then yes, move it to the morning, and you won't put on as much weight as you will if you eat it at night. That's the finding. But no, nice big picture of cake there, taking up space that could have been used to report the methodological details. Okay. And the final set of things that happen, and this is kind of light-hearted stuff. We'll wind it down with this. Okay, researchers' terms, technical terms, jargon are misused. Okay, so let's have a look at some examples of jargon. This is a wasp that some zoologists discovered. And when one zoologist found the wasp, he said, aha. And his friend zoologist nearby said, ha. And so they decided to name the wasp, Ahaha. Okay? And they wrote this up in a paper. This is how they came up with the name for the wasp. Ahaha. So scientific language isn't always as technical as you might believe. Then these other entomologists were looking for a beetle in the Agra genus. So they had found all the other Agra beetles, but they couldn't find this one, and they knew it existed. So they eventually found it, and they decided they would, in its honor, name it the aggravation. Okay, so scientists do say the funniest things. Burger anus is a type of bird. Now, I do not know the story behind the naming of burger anus, and to be honest, I'm not sure I want to know. But again, it's another thing, the name that's out there that is kind of ridiculous. This chemical composition compound is called penguinol. And it's called penguinol because they figure it looks a bit like a penguin. Okay. We've got all of these other things, traumatic acid, moronic acid, erotic acid. These are all things that emerge, and the words sound funny when you actually use them. Abbreviations are no exception. Dead, dump, and barf are three things, and of course there are sort of ways in which you can sort of link them to their concepts. Here's some stuff. I won't read it out because I know that you are delicate, you have delicate ears. But hold on, actually I will read this one. Coming tonight is a mineral that is found, it was just first discovered in Cummington, Massachusetts. So they call it coming tonight. Okay, there you go. And this is definitely out of bounds, but I'll give you a moment to study it yourself. These are all other things that appear in the literature as terms. Okay. All right. I guess the point is, when you find your homeopaths and your alchemists and your pseudoscientists, they often try to get jargon going. They really try to get long words and things that sound scientific. But there's a big difference between something that sounds scientific and is scientific, because sometimes things that are scientific don't sound scientific at all. They sound faintly ridiculous, and sometimes that's accidental, and sometimes it's in fact deliberate. So there is an issue here with jargon. What the lay audience thinks about jargon is different to what the lab scientist thinks about jargon. The lab scientist is happy to play fast and loose with jargon, come up with something funny if necessary, if they're in the mood. But the lay person doesn't realize or see that side of things. Daily Mail again, psychologists warn of casual link between internet porn and rise in sex offences. This is science news written by somebody who doesn't know what a causal link is, and misread the word causal link and wrote in casual link. And throughout the report, it says the casual link has been found between internet porn and rise in sex offences. So even something as simple as that can cause confusion at the level of jargon alone. Never mind methodology or context or previous research or frames or triggers. Okay, here's another set of examples, and it relates to research that people do on gay communities. Now, I explored this a little bit earlier in the year, and I drew attention to the fact that in Ireland we have this new situation, that Ireland was the first country to vote as a popular vote in a referendum to have marriage equality written into the constitution and protected from politicians, basically, and have it so that people can get married regardless of their sex. And everyday people in Ireland and across Europe, in my experience, are perfectly comfortable with these types of ideas. I made reference to my mother and my mother-in-law sitting on the couch the day after the result was announced, which is an overwhelming vote in favour of marriage equality. And these are 70, nearly 80-year-old women talking happily about a wonderful result and how this was great and all the people they knew. But in science, in academia, particularly social sciences, we're still shy talking about gay sex. We don't want to say gay people. We certainly don't want to say queer people. We want to say this, men who have sex with men. So you end up with this is actually the term that is recommended by some to be used for fear that offence might be caused. And the point I'm making here is that the jargon becomes cumbersome and counterproductive. So you get these kind of strange papers about men who have sex with men in Norway. And this is not how real people talk. A man who has sex with men with social work training was recruited to conduct the interviews. In other words, a gay social worker was recruited to conduct but they don't want to say this because they fear that this is not scientific enough, so they kind of come up with this other construction. And it creates genuine ambiguity. So you have research looking at whether or not prior history of abuse is a risk factor for future mental health in populations where sexual health and sexual health care provision are not necessarily as they should be, because sexual health care provision is often heterosexist in its orientation. So you have this research that talks about men who have sex with men with depression. But there's a genuine ambiguity there. Is it the gay man who has depression, or is it his partner who has depression? And you don't know. You read the whole paper, you don't know whether it is the partner's depression that is a risk factor for your depression, or whether it is your depression or your history that is a risk factor. So you get people with this history, men who have sex with men with this history. With what history? Is it you have sex? Is it gay men with this history, or is it gay men whose partners have this history? It's totally ambiguous, and it's as though the scientific or the social scientific researcher would rather have the ambiguity than use a term that everybody in the community uses, because they are worried that that might be seen as somehow casual or unfriendly or not scientific enough. Okay, so when we report things in the media, it often is different to the way it is conceived in science. So we have the triggers that stimulate the research, we have the frames that things are forced into, and we have the loss of context and detail. What might we do about this? Well, I mentioned that people think about scientists in particular ways. And people think that science is some kind of magic that happens in a laboratory. I mean, they really do. But in actual fact, science is a form of epistemology. It's a way of reasoning, it's a way of arguing. You gather data in order to test theories. And it's full of assumptions. Many scientists are not really familiar with them, but it's full of all sorts of philosophical assumptions. If you have good communication, you can help people understand better. But here's my actual focus. People often recommend that journalists need to get their act together and get with it and understand science better. But I would be a proponent of the view that it actually is only half solved when this happens. That what we really need are scientists, including social scientists, behavioral scientists, economic scientists, who are media literate. They need to have media training as much as the journalists need to have science training. Because the way in which the scientists explain their work needs to take account of all of these things that happen when science is pitched to public audiences. And with that regard, I would encourage you all to bear in mind the way in which science gets channeled through communication and the way in which that might be improved. So thank you very much for your time and attention.